Are the Falcons going for an all defensive draft this year? Boy, I hope not.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Knowles, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So nothing has changed in regards to Kirk Cousins. Can the Falcons get more out of Kyle Pitts? And of course, Terry and Raheem Morris spoke to various media members today, and India will be reacting to some of that later in today's episode. But one of the big sort of things that emerged from today is that the Falcons, like so many other NFL teams, have the privilege of being able to conduct up to 45 18-minute interviews with various prospects all week long in Indianapolis. And reportedly, the Falcons are using all of those on defensive players. They interviewed a bunch of guys on Monday night when they first arrived. All of those guys were defensive players, and that seems to be the trend that will continue. None of their offensive assistant coaches made the trip to Naptown in order to participate in this year's combine. And so it sounds a lot like Falcons are going all defense in this year's draft. And I'm sure that's music to the ears of so many Falcon fans who have been pining for that type of draft for many, many years. And of course, with 5 draft picks so far in the 2025 draft, it makes sense to use all of those on defensive players because the Falcons have 5 potential holes to upgrade starting positions on defense, right? In no particular order: nose tackle, edge rusher, linebacker, cornerback, safety, right? Now, we hope that when we get to April, the Falcons will have more than 5 draft picks, but we'll see. And, we'll talk more about some of the ways that the Falcons could acquire more draft picks between now and then, such as trading Kyle Pitts later on today's episode, but that we'll save that for later. But I'll sit here and say, guys, if you ask me, should the Falcons go all defense in this year's draft? My answer is hell no. Okay? Because there's one position of egregious need on the offensive side of the ball that the Falcons have to draft in this year's draft because they haven't addressed it the last couple of years. They're not talking about a want, we're talking about a need, and that's the offensive tackle position, right? And the hope is that when the Falcons acquire more of these draft picks that we're talking about, they'll have the freedom as well as to solve some of these defensive woes in free agency, right? That's kind of the big question of the offseason, right? When we get to next week, when we get that week and a half blitz between then and the start of the year and free agency and whatnot, right? Can the Falcons cross 2 or 3 of these needs off their checklist on the defensive side of the ball in March rather than waiting until April? Because with only 5 picks, a first, a second, a fourth, and 2 sevenths, you're not getting starters with all those picks, right? You're certainly not getting starters in round 7. You'll be lucky to get a starter in round 4, right? You go back to the 2022 draft where now we have 3 years to judge. How many of those 4th round picks taken that year or started this past year in the NFL? 13 out of 38, about a third. So if the Falcons can find a way, as they should, to have 7 or more picks this year, probably 5 or 6 of those should come on the defense, right? So I'm all in favor of the Falcons using at least 5 picks on the defensive side of the ball, but I don't think that should be all of their picks because they need to use one of those on an offensive tackle. Why is offensive tackle such a need? Jake Matthews just turned 33. And yes, the Matthews family has the bloodline where his dad, Bruce, played until he was 40. His uncle, Clay, played until he was 40. But and Jake could easily play that long. Well, easily is maybe not the right word, but certainly could play that long. We hope he does. But no well-run organization is counting on an offensive tackle to play until he's 40. And more importantly, Caleb McGarry just turned 30, and he's going into the final year of his contract. And you have a young left-handed quarterback that needs a long-term solution to protect his blind side. And, I don't know about Caleb McGarry's bloodlines, but I don't expect him to play until he's 40, nor do I particularly want Caleb McGarry to play until he's 40, despite, being the head of tourism on McGarry Island. Right? We got to retire, and sip some Mai Tais on this beach. Right? So I've been saying this about the offensive tackle need since the 2023 draft. I've been pushing for the Falcons to use some of these middle round picks on an offensive tackle. We talked a lot about that 2023 summer where the Falcons desperately needed help at swing tackle. They were able to land on Storm Norton back then. He's been a serviceable, solid stopgap, swing tackle for them, but he's not a replacement for a draft pick because Storm Norton's going to turn 31 in May, right? He's at the end of his career. But part of the reason why the Falcons, in my humble opinion, have not been able to find that offensive tackle, A, complacency, B, their willingness to trade up, right? The past 3 years, we've seen the Falcons trade up in round 2, trading up in 2022 to get Arnold Levichetti, gave up a 4th, did a similar trade in 23 for Matthew Bergeron, gave him a 4th, and last year, trading up for Ruggiero, giving up a 3rd. And all you have to do is look at the next offensive tackle off the board with those picks that the Falcons gave up. 2022, that was Zach Tom, a player I loved, currently starting right tackle for the Green Bay Packers. 2023, DeJuan Jones, right, was hurt this past year, but had a very productive rookie season as a starting right tackle for the Cleveland Browns. And this past year, the Pitt legend, Matt Gonsalves, is currently slated to be the starting right tackle for the Indianapolis Colts in 2025. And again, I'm not stretching this. This is literally the next offensive tackle off the board for each one of those picks. And right, it's interesting when you think about the one time that Terry Fontenot and company have traded back in round 2. Back in 2021, they picked up a 4th round pick that turned into Drew Dahlman, right? He's an impending free agent. I'm more optimistic than others that he'll re-sign, but let's say he does, potentially your starting center for the next 3 to 5 years. And so to me, these picks that the Falcons, are acquiring are really valuable picks, particularly when it comes to the offensive line. And to me, it perfectly illustrates the value of trading back as opposed to trading up. And that trade back conversation is probably going to be an ongoing conversation as we roll throughout this offseason getting in April. I'm sort of the opinion that the Falcons probably should trade back in round 1, probably should trade back in round 2, trade back as much as possible. They need to accumulate as many assets as possible, especially in those middle rounds where the strength of this draft class is. It's not really at the top of this draft in the round 1. It's rounds 2, 3, 4 is really where you want to be loaded with draft picks, in my opinion, in this year's draft class. But again, we'll address that as the rest of the offseason on goes. But, the focus of this draft should absolutely be on the defensive side of the ball. I want to make that clear. Right, the focus of this offseason should absolutely be on the defense side of the ball. We've been talking about that since the bye week back in November, how, this team's probably set to, spend the bulk of their resources on upgrading defense this offseason. So I like the fact that they're focused on defense. The fact that they're only interviewing defensive players, great. It's awesome, right? In the first 2 rounds, go all defense. But once we start getting to those middle rounds, hopefully where the Falcons have more picks than they currently have, our attention will turn to the offensive tackle position. We talked about this during the Senior Bowl week. Go back and listen to those episodes. We talked about a bunch of offensive tackles. I was like, hey, these are some of the guys that are projected to be in that 3rd, 4th round range. Would be a perfect option for the Atlanta Falcons, looking for, a potential heir apparent at one or both of their offensive tackle positions. So hopefully Terry has learned that lesson, make up for the mistakes of being too aggressive trading up in round 2. Maybe trade back in round 2. Maybe trade back in round 1 and recoup that mistake, right? So we'll see how the Falcons do it, right? Trade back is certainly a possible way for the Falcons to acquire more middle round picks that they currently do not possess. Another way is potentially trading someone like Kyle Pitts. And Terry and Raheem both spoke on Kyle Pitts' status and future in Atlanta, and we'll break down what it means. Will he be back in 2025 as we continue today's Locked On Falcons? So when speaking to the media, both Terry Fontenot and Raheem Morris were asked about Kyle Pitts, and their statements essentially mirrored each other. They got the company line down, right? It's about getting more out of Kyle Pitts. Terry Fontenot mentioned how, maybe Kyle Pitts came in with unrealistic and high expectations, given that he was the 4th overall selection. Raheem talked about his flashes of greatness. I don't think anything that was said today, changes the math when it comes to, is Kyle Pitts going to be in Atlanta in 2025? Right? If your opinion was that there's no chance that Kyle Pitts got traded, nothing they said is going to change your mind on that. And if you're of the opinion that Kyle Pitts has already played his last snap in Atlanta, nothing, basically the same applies. And now I've said before, I think there's a 60% chance that the Falcons move Kyle Pitts this offseason. I think it's more likely than not that he has played his last snap in Atlanta. Now, I'm basing that opinion not off of anything that was said. I'm basing that off of actions, right? We know actions speak louder than words, and their actions over the last few months tell me that this team has really no interest in keeping Kyle Pitts, right? The fact that Charlie Warner was getting more snaps than Kyle Pitts, in depending on where you want to make your arbitrary cutoff, the last 7 games, the last 10 games, kind of tells me that. That's their actions, right? And, I want people to better understand this because I've gotten, shout out to my YouTube commenters, but, some of my YouTube comments don't really understand the concept of nuance. Yes. But, I firmly believe in my mind that Kyle Pitts has enormous potential in this offense. And if the Falcons can unlock it, right, that's going to be a huge catalyst for potentially catapulting this offense into the top 10 unit that they probably need to be this upcoming season to maximize their chances of making the playoffs. But it doesn't feel like the Falcons, right? That's my opinion. But it doesn't feel like the Falcons actually have any interest in tapping that potential. So in a nutshell, to me, Kyle Pitts' role in this offense last year was basically no different than Tyler Higbee's role in the Rams offense throughout his years in LA, where he was primarily a blocker, an afterthought in the passing game. There were certainly some years where Higbee was number 2 or number 3 on the Rams in receiving yards, but those were primarily years where they had a bunch of injuries at wide receiver and someone had to step up and catch the football. Normally, he was like the 4th or 5th option in the passing game. And that makes sense for Tyler Higbee. I don't think that makes sense for Kyle Pitts, given his talent level, right? And to me, essentially, asking Kyle Pitts to play that similar role is trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And to me, what the Falcons should be trying to do, and maybe some of the things that they were saying this in this presser, is an indicator of that. But again, I'll believe it when I see it, because again, actions speak louder than words, is that they need to create a square hole for Kyle Pitts to fit in. And if they do, this offense can cook. But again, their actions, at least the last couple of months of the season, showed that they weren't interested in creating that square hole for Kyle Pitts. And the analogy I've used in the past when it's come to what this team wants to use that tight end for is that they want, a minivan, Tyler Higbee type, the Charlie Warner type, when they have a Lambo, which is Kyle Pitts. And essentially the Lambo is collecting dust in the garage. And I sit here and say, well, if that's what it's going to be, then you might as well trade it. Get something for him now rather than wait and get nothing for him later, right? Are you going to give Kyle Pitts a second contract? Currently, the answer is no. Right. So where's real upside in keeping him, this season? And right in the Locked On Falcons Insider, when I was talking about this extensively last Friday on the podcast, the Locked On Falcons Insider was like, well, they should keep him, right? And again, this is exactly how his voice sounds. I don't know. I'm kidding. But like they should keep him, right? And then he could potentially improve his stock, and then they could tag him and then trade him for even more than a 3rd round pick or whatever. But I sat there and I was like, if the end goal is to trade him away, why are you waiting around? Especially if the chances of him improving his stock are minimal, because he's going to continue to be a square peg in a round hole. And I feel like, I've seen a couple of comments that are stuck on the idea of, taking Kyle Pitts 4th overall and only accepting a 3rd round pick. And that's foolish. And I just don't think those people understand the reality of how trades work in the NFL. You're not going to get a return on your investment, right? The analogy I would use is, hey, you spent $100,000 on that Lambo, but that money is gone. You're not getting it back. And hoping that you're going to get a return on an investment, to me, is foolish, right? So your options are basically, you can either sell the Lambo now via trade, right? And get $20,000, get something, or you can do nothing and get $0 when he walks in free agency in 2026, right? The equivalent, again, this is not a perfect analogy, but it's going to get repossessed and you're not going to get anything. It's just going to be gone. You're going to wake up one day and it's going to be gone. And again, I think too many fans focus on the value of the pick. The pick is spent. That money is spent. You're not getting that money back. Now it's about the player. And I agree wholeheartedly that if you can find a way to incorporate the unique unicorn-like skill set that Kyle Pitts has into your offense, you will be better for it than you would be trading him. Right? So it's basically the idea of, instead of asking your Lambo to make these Costco runs that you would as a minivan, or, carpool the kids to school or whatever, right? Instead, what you need to be doing is trying to find those legal street races that you can enter the Lambo in, that you can win, some cash and get some of that value back, right? Not hauling milk to and from Costco as the Falcons want to do. Now, again, I'll continue to say that remains to be seen. Again, Terry and Raheem are saying the things you want to hear, right? Kyle's going to put in the work, and we as a coaching staff and we as an organization are going to put in the work this offseason to get the most out of him. But again, these are just words. I need to see actions. And right, this is part of the reason why I scrutinize Zach Robinson so much, criticize Zach Robinson so much, because he looked at this unicorn of a tight end and was like, what we should do? I see Tyler Higbee, and I'm like, this is your king, guys? This is the guy that you're going to trust to turn this offense into one of the best in the NFL? I'm like, all right, man. So when Zach Robinson was saying that, I was like, oh, well, they're going to use him more like a traditional tight end, but they're still going to, incorporate his unique skill set into the offense. And I was like, no, they're not really going to do that. They did it for like October. That's about it. And then they stopped. But I'll save my anti-Zach Robinson tirade for another day. We'll have plenty this offseason. Trust me. Don't want to blow on my wad in February. I got to spread it out. But, I think the real question of where the debate is going to be is, whether or not you're going to get an offer, that $20,000 offer for that Lambeau, right? That's where we're talking about, getting that trade offer. And opinions vary, right? We had Josh Kendall of The Athletic on the podcast. He expressed last week, he expressed in his writings this week that he doesn't think you're going to get that type of offer for Kyle Pitts. And that's understandable, right? Again, that's why I put the odds at 60%. I think there's a 40% chance that Josh is right, but we'll see on that front. And so I wanted to clear that up because, again, I think some people kind of miss the nuance of that conversation. So if it was up to what I want Kyle Pitts to stay in Atlanta and be a 7-time Pro Bowler, and we can talk about him having a conversation at some point in the future about whether he's the best tight end in Falcons history over Algie Crumpler and Tony Gonzalez and all those guys. That's what I want. But, the other thing I want is, to be Mr. Knowles and let Beyonce be my sugar mama. But as we know, you can't always get what you want. So later this offseason, should Kyle Pitts still be around, we'll probably take a deeper dive in some of the ways that Zach Robinson can adjust his offense to unlock his full potential in this offense. But that's probably a May conversation. So the rest of today's conversation, we'll talk about what little update we got on Kirk Cousins as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. And right, if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay, whether you're betting the over-under on Trae Young's points or how many steals Dyson Daniels. How many times are you going to sit there and shout out cookies every time Dyson Daniels gets a steal? Defensive Player of the Year odds. It's all available for you at FanDuel right now. And if you're a new customer, you can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com to shoot your shot for $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So the big talking point in regards to Kirk Cousins, when Terry Fontenot was asked about his status, nothing has changed. Right, referring to what Terry Fontenot said back at the beginning of January when he last spoke to the media at the year-end presser, when he basically said the team is comfortable with Kirk staying as a backup. And it's not a surprise that Terry said this, right? As we said then, and we'll again reiterate today, Terry kind of has to say this stuff just to maintain any semblance of trade value for Kirk Cousins. Because when it comes to trading Kirk, right, I'm the Josh Kendall in this situation. I don't think there's going to be a market for him. Since I think everybody and their mama seems to know and expect the Falcons to have to cut Kirk Cousins ahead of that March 16 deadline when his $10 million roster bonus that is due in 2026 becomes fully guaranteed. I think the NFL teams are going to look at the Falcons like, okay, you're going to keep Kirk Cousins as a backup quarterback? Okay, we'll call your bluff and we'll just wait. There's no rush. We're not in any rush, right? No one's going to be scrambling. We got to get Kirk Cousins signed today, right? And so to me, it's not really about what Terry Fontenot or Raheem Morris say about Kirk Cousins this week. I'm waiting for the Diana Rossinis, the Adam Schefters, the Tom Pelisseros, the Ian Rappaports. What do they have to say, right? Or rather, what do their sources have to say? And for those of you that don't know, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Just come a little closer, right? Their sources are Kirk's agent, Mike McCartney, right? When they say, according to my sources, they're talking to Mike McCartney, Kirk's agent. And as I said back in January, Kirk and his representation are really the deciders when it comes to that, due to that no trade clause. They have all the leverage here in sort of determining what his outcome is. Now, ideally, someone will, I'll be wrong, and someone will come trade for Kirk Cousins. But what happens if he doesn't waive that no trade clause, which is his right? I know there's a lot of Falcon fans that believe the Falcons should essentially hold Kirk Cousins hostage, and I vehemently disagree with this. Because to me, the chances of developing a trade after March 16th is very low. It's not zero. Nothing is zero, right? Again, chance. Beyonce, hit me up. Call me, okay? It's non-zero chance that she'll call me, right? But it's nearly zero. We all understand that, right? So your hope is that some team between now and then, March 16th, is basically going to get a little desperate and try to jump to the front of the line by trading for Kirk Cousins, right? Because once he gets cut, if he gets cut, right, there's going to be multiple teams wooing him. I don't know. Multiple suitors trying to woo Kirk. What's that word? Suiting. That's not a word. And we've had multiple reporters from various teams, like the Jets and other teams, talking about, yes, this team should be interested in Kirk if if he gets cut, right? Because then they can sign him for a veteran minimum for like $1.3 million rather than having to give up $27.5 million to get Kirk Cousins on a 1-year deal. So if the Falcons do keep Kirk Cousins beyond March 16th, right, I think the rest of those teams are like, if the Falcons are like, no, we're not bluffing, we're going to keep Kirk, I think the rest of the league is just going to be like, okay, well, we're just going to move on. We're going to move on to Daniel Jones and Russell Wilson and Justin Fields and Sam Darnold and Aaron Rodgers, right? And then we're going to move on to the draft and Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders and Jackson Dart, right? And so this idea that I've seen so many Falcon fans express is like, if we just wait, eventually we'll move them. And it's like, I think you're being naive, right? From the Falcons' perspective, it totally makes sense to wait because you potentially could save more money against this year's cap or next year's cap, right, than you would from outright cutting him as a post-June 1 designation. But from any other NFL team's perspective, there's no real incentive for them to wait on Kirk Cousins, right? The time when teams are going to be most aggressive trying to land that veteran quarterback is going to be the beginning of the offseason, that first week in March, right? They're not going to be as aggressive the end of March, beginning of April, May, June, etc., especially for a stopgap like Kirk. And shout out to my guy Kevin Knight over at the Falcoholic, 30 Birds and Brews podcast, right? We have differing opinions on this, right? He's basically, I've heard him frame it on his podcast, you know, it's risking $10 million in 2026 to potentially save $27 million in 2025. And that seems pretty logical at first, but here's my problem with that, right? The longer you wait, you're just wasting the $27.5 million. It's not $27.5 million that you're saving against this year's cap that you can now use to improve your roster, right? You're only going to get $2.5 million in savings if you trade Kirk between now and June 1st, right? That's basically the equivalent of signing Ross Dwelley and Kevin King. That's not moving the needle for your football team. And you could potentially save $27.5 million if you wait till after June to trade Kirk. But by then, like, that money's not going to help the Falcons in any way because the free agent market's going to dry up by that point. Not to mention, teams will probably have solved all their quarterback woes up at that point, right? And the chances of an injury happening, that's happened like once in the last decade. It's 2016 with Teddy Bridgewater. Like, you know, it's like a 2% chance of that happening, right? Of a quarterback getting injured or whatever. Really, it's less than 2%. It's like 0.3% if we want to really do the math, but I won't bore you with the details on that. Right. But if you look at the free agent market after June, when the Falcons get all that money to spend now to improve their roster, who was the most impactful free agent signing after June 1st last year? Calais Campbell with the Dolphins, right? Those are the players that are available in June, guys. The old guys, not the young guys that you're hoping that are going to be fixtures. It's the Matthew Judons, it's the Justin Simmons, it's the Calais Campbells. Again, they can help your football team, but we kind of know that doesn't necessarily solve problems. That's just putting a Band-Aid on a problem. So by holding Kirk Cousins hostage after March 16, to me, you're just essentially wasting the money that you legitimately could be using to improve your roster, which is the $10 million in 2026. Right? That is money that could help your team. Again, not in 2025, but certainly in 2026. So no offense to Kevin and all those that agree with him, but to me, this is the difference between being a fan and a general manager. The fan wants to be petty and be like, we're going to save face, right? That's really the only reason to keep Kirk Cousins beyond March 16th. The GM is like, what do I have to do to make my football team better? And to me, cutting Kirk Cousins, if a trade doesn't develop between now and March 16th, is the right move. All right, so we'll see what happens this week as the rumor mill, transpires, rolls along, right? Last year, this week, during Combine week, in the 2.5 weeks leading up to the Combine, right? I was sitting here on this podcast saying, hey, guys, I think Kirk Cousins is going to be the Falcons quarterback next year. And a lot of people were like, Aaron, I don't think you know what you're talking about. And then we got the Combine week, and then all the insiders were like, I think Kirk Cousins is going to be the Falcons quarterback next year. And people were like, if only there was a daily podcast that was telling me that for 2.5 weeks. Just like this year, for 3 months, I've been telling you, I think the Falcons going to cut Kirk Cousins with the post-June 1 cut. And then maybe we'll get some various NFL insiders that will be like, you know what? I think the Falcons are going to cut Kirk Cousins with the post-1 cut. And people are like, wow, what a revelation. What a shocker. I have never heard this information before. But of course, we're actually going to hope that for the fourth time ever, I'm actually wrong on a thing. And that those various insiders, instead of talking about Kirk being cut, they're going to talk about, hey, the Steelers and the Titans and the Jets and the Raiders and whoever else are all showing considerable interest in trading for Kirk Cousins. And we'll be sitting here like, oh, yippee, oh, that 5th round pick, that special teams player, that backup safety, it's going to do wonders for this football team. That's what we're hoping for, guys. So we'll see if that happens. We'll see what develops later this week in Indianapolis. But at least for the rest of the week here on Locked On Falcons, we'll be talking more about the combine testing. We'll take a deeper dive into sort of what these guys need to, especially at the pass rusher position, right? What these guys need to do to show out, what are quote unquote first tier athletes versus second tier athletes, and so many other topics. Maybe we'll explore more of the trade back conversation and whatnot, what the combine testing looks like, some of these other positions beyond the pass rushers. All that is in store for you here on Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, if you want to get more insight into all the big stories this week in Indianapolis, check out Locked On NFL Draft as your second listen, where Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez are giving you the lowdown on all the scoops on all the top prospects in the 2025 NFL draft class. And of course, you can find Locked On NFL Draft along with so many other great shows, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Sports Atlanta, as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.